We are now on book number 19, No Fear, starring Gilliman, a little bit of Lorgar, or a warp facsimile of Lorgar at least, and of course the Ultramarines and the Word Bearers. This is actually one of my favorite books, because it's one of the books where we actually start seeing the Loyalists fighting back. We've had 19 books now of the Loyalists getting primarily beaten and acting like complete and utter retards whilst doing so. Even the God Emperor's custodies so far have been little more than an excruciatingly detailed example in how not to do anything ever. And yet, now, finally, in this book, we will see Gilliman being Gilliman, doing some Gilliman shit, doing some Primarch shit, and his legion rallying from the brink of defeat even whilst horribly outmatched, surprised, and just fuckered in every single way, and yet still making a fight out of it. It's been a long time coming, but finally the fight back against the nefarious traitors begin. Not for the custodies, mind you. They're gonna have to wait a whole lot longer before they get any kind of recompense. But hey, we take what we can get, don't we? And I gotta say too, the build-up in this book is masterfully executed. It starts by essentially telling you precisely what's going to happen. And in this case, I think that is the precisely correct choice. We all know what's going to happen. Word Bearers and Ultramarines right next to one another after Istvan? Yeah, of course. We all know. And so there's no point in hiding it. There's no point in pretending like, oh, we don't know. Could it be? Could it be? Of course, yeah, it's nonsense. Instead, it is much, much smarter to build up a sense of dread, to place the Word Bearers right next to the Ultramarines and make you wonder, like, when it's going to happen, when it's going to happen. It even starts with the capture of a bulk hauler. And it says, like, okay, the Mark of Calth, that is the mark of combat being initiated. And this is a system the Ultramarines use. Hours, minutes, and days. So that in training exercises, they can refer to a specific mark, a specific hour, minute, and second, and go like, this backs up my theoretical, or this is what I base it on, and so on. Just the kind of autistic nonsense the Ultramarines would absolutely indulge in. And the Mark of Calth doesn't start until, I think it was something like 130 odd hours after the initial hostile action, the seizing of the bulk hauler. That's really cool too. And every chapter or so, it gives you another mark, like Mark of Calth minus so and so many hours until action. It's really cool because again, it's super effective at building up the suspense of what is going to happen. Dan Abnett has done a really good job with this book, absolutely. We also get introduced to Thiel, an ultramarine with a red helmet, which at this point is a mark of censure. This was a really nice touch as well. So, a lot of the things that often happens when you're writing backstory like this is that you come up with a thing that in retrospect is like, oh, cool, that's where that comes from. And often it sounds somewhat ridiculous or forced, but this makes perfect sense. The Ultramarines, an ass-tight fucking unit like them, they would absolutely require you to paint your own helmet to show your shame and to set you apart from your brothers. Absolutely. And since his sin, as we will later learn, well, I'm not gonna keep that secret because it's rather obvious, was to run theoreticals on the Ultramarines' combat against other legions. It is then made a mark of honor after the Mark of Calth has been running for a while. And Gilliman is like, okay, yeah, red helmets. Clearly that is no longer a mark of censure. You did the only right thing. From now on, that is a mark of veterancy and forethought. That is brilliant. I fucking love that. It makes so much sense both in universe, in the lore, in the Ultramarines, all of it. It's really good. And we also get a nice little look into the speculations of the Ultramarines as to what's happening and why it's happening. So the Ultramarines are being mobilized in almost their full strength, just, garrison forces and defensive organizations scattered throughout Ultramar. Most of their strength is now gathered on Calth. where they are awaiting sizable elements of the Wordbearer's Legion to launch what they think is going to be an attack upon an Orc empire, Xeno's hold, to crush it before it can become any kind of threat to Macragge and to Calth in specific, which is growing to be one of the capital worlds of Ultramar. Makes sense, and they're even rationalizing it to themselves. This is Horus, the War Master, marking out his authority, or even potentially trying, maybe he's being smart about this. Maybe he knows that the Wordbearers and the Ultramarines obviously are not on the best terms after that whole Monarchia thing, and is using this to kind of smooth things over, Nothing like the heat of battle to get brothers to trust one another again. It's really cool. Again, it's an entirely believable excuse, and there's no reason whatsoever why the Ultramarines would be on guard here. Now, the fact that the news of Istvan hasn't reached them, that's one of those little derp things, because again, with the warp operating the way it does, there's no reason why it couldn't have, and at the same time, there's no reason why it should have either, because, warp. And this, again, is before the Ruin Storm. This is before the creation of the mass interference that made travel and everything so difficult. But, of course, again, you can also argue that the Gods of Chaos are, of course, intervening and keeping the information flowing slowly, too. And speaking of slow change, we also get a rather interesting insight in Guilliman's view of the future and his legion's place within it. I believe I've remarked upon this before, but some of the legions are unsure of where they fit into the Great Crusade once the fighting is over, what their place is within the Imperium. Some despair, believing there to be no place, some rage against it, some simply don't care and just don't want to think about it. Guilliman has thought about it an awful lot. He has considered it a great deal, and he is of the opinion that the Emperor would never do something so short-minded as to create a force like the Adeptus Astartes just to discard them when he's finished using them. A sentiment that I personally do agree with. I believe that the Thunder Warriors, for example, were not intentionally flawed. I believe that that was simply a side effect of the Emperor not having perfected his craft at the time. Whether or not you wish to pass some moral judgment on his failings in that regard, well, feel free. But the Astartes are free from this, and the Emperor knows this as well, that he would have hundreds of thousands of superhuman warriors with nothing to do. That's not true. Russ would always be there to be the ultimate sanction, the executioner. The Wordbearers, I believe, were intended to be some kind of champions of the Imperial truth, that was supposed to proselytize it rather than him as a god. The Ultramarines, well, they are the consummate bureaucrats, and Guilliman understands this too, although perhaps the word bureaucrat has a little bit too much of a negative connotation in this particular regard. Guilliman wishes to teach his warriors to be more than just warriors. He wants them to be philosophers, theorists, rulers. He basically says outright that at the end of the Crusade, he wants each and every single legionary to be the ruler of his own world, and therefore guide it. Now, that of course a hell of a lot more than 100,000 worlds in the Imperium, so they'd probably end up ruling a hell of a lot more than just one world, but I mean, that's a good idea. The superhuman mind of a Space Marine would be supremely well fitted to dealing with the intricacies of high-level diplomacy, of the governance of a world, the organization of it, maintaining its prosperity, and so on. There is no reason why a Space Marine could not fulfill such a duty. Of course, #not all, I doubt the World Eaters would work quite as well in this regard, although bear in mind, before the World Eaters became the World Eaters and Angron did his nonsense with them, they were not the Legion they are today. They were not uncontrolled killers. The entire idea of the Warhounds was controlled aggression, honed aggression, aggression as a weapon, not berserk rage. Guilliman also mentions this, that some of his brothers, like Angron, Well, probably they've never thought about what they're going to do after compliance, and when it finally comes for them, well, I don't know. Gilliman doesn't say as much, but I suspect that Russ might have been busy in such a circumstance, but we will of course never know. It is undoubted that some legions would adopt better to peace than others. And speaking of adopting, we get a couple interesting things here too, with the Ultramarines having prepared the defense of Calth using a system of servers. This being Mechanicus adepts who control the vast space around Calth and its huge planetary defense weapons grids and all of its orbital defenses as well. This network of servers, several individuals scattered around Calth, have final say on anything and everything that goes on in system, and the system is so sensitive as to trigger a firing solution that must then be manually rejected whenever anything happens. Now that sounds to me like a fucking retarded system, because the data inflow will be ridiculous. But apparently that's what they've decided. And the servers, bearing in mind these are Adeptus Mechanicus Magi, now have to control all of that manually. Now, the server in primary command refuses to give over this power to the machine spirits, the machines themselves. Not machine spirits at this point necessarily, but over to the computer systems designed to handle it, because he sees this as a compromise on his own ethics. He is basically a puritanical adept of the machine god. This is a view that basically all adepts share to some degree, but the level of which varies quite significantly. And that is that the machine is not a replacement for humanity. It is an addition to humanity. It is the purity of humanity and the superiority of humanity that allows anything else to happen. And the moment that they surrender complete control over to the machine or become less than human, that is when they have lost. This also, by the way, is one of the reasons why the recent few books with the Adeptus Mechanicus using gender-neutral pronouns is such utter nonsense, because gender is an intrinsic part of humanity, and no Adeptus Mechanicus Magi would ever willingly divulge himself away from a piece of humanity. Because at the end of the day, they are, as I've said on so many different occasions, human supremacists who believe that the machine is nothing without the human. And another little nice touch as well, Hest is actually married to another adept that is serving in his command tower. And the way the two's feelings for each other are described in such a delightful way, honestly. It's like two semi-computers trying to figure out what love is. It's adorable, and it lends much-needed humanity to the Mechanicus adepts. There's a big issue in way too many 40k novels that the Mechanicus guys are just, boring. They're just computers, or they have some kind of hyper-logical sense, and they speak in binary all the time, and they come across as very alien. It misses, again, the entire point that the Adeptus Mechanicus are humans first, and machines a distant second. Sadly, one of them isn't going to live too long, but hey, details. The word bearers have also adapted to this. They have a plan to knock out the defensive grid by overloading it with something called scrap code. Now, scrap code is something that is apparently generated by any system in 40k. It is small quantities of nonsensical data, which is useless essentially, which, that makes sense. Any hyper-advanced and complicated data system is eventually going to start having little errors pop up, little things where the system doesn't quite function in exactly the way it's supposed to be, and these will eventually start just adding up over time. It is an almost unavoidable part of really high complex programming, because you just can't foresee every single eventuality. But in this case, the scrap code is far more advanced than that. There are several camps across Calth where the word-bearer Imperial Army Regiment, regular human troops, are carrying out various rituals that include the reading of the names of high-level demons, I presume, into voxcasters. And through this medium, they will then infiltrate the defensive grid. These are 8 names that can then be repeated 8 times, and that can then be repeated again times 8 ad infinitum, essentially. 8 times, 8 times, blah, 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 blah. So they can keep reading out these names. Now, there is one limitation in that each name will kill whoever is speaking it, but human life comes awfully cheap to the servants of chaos, after all. Once again, I'm reminded of Lorgar. I just want what's best for humanity. Fuck Lorgar. But this, of course, infects the system with literal demonic entities corrupting the new sphere irreversibly. Kind of clever. It's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina, but I can entirely get that this is something that could happen. I mean, they're goddamn demons. They do whatever the warp tells them to do, I suppose. And it's a really neat description as well, where they describe a group of 8 volunteers in a very ceremonial fashion, you know. The sergeant who's guarding them gives them a kiss on both cheeks and gives them a blessing before they then open up a bottle containing water. They draw out a slip of paper, then starts literally burning up the moment it comes in contact with air, and they then have to read out the name, and it literally fries their brains. Like, he describes their eyes starting to melt and such on. It's really cool. There's also a quick mention of Ultramarines librarians, although they're not librarians at this point due to the Edict of Nicaea, which is still fucking retarded. The reasons for the Edict of Nicaea were... I'm not even going to get into it here, but a lot of librarians, several hundred of them scattered throughout the Legion, start getting headaches. And they all ignore it because, well, they have no idea what they're supposed to be looking for, you know? It's just a headache, attributed to fatigue. There's one part of the book that I kind of disagree with, saying that, oh, there were so many warnings. There wasn't really. Like, you could say that, yes, there were warnings, but they are warnings that are... How do I put it? No reasonable mind would ever interpret them as such, is how I would probably put it. It would be like standing outside, looking up at the sky and seeing a blinking light, and then assume that that was a meteor about to crush you. You know, it could be the case. That could be the reason why there's a blinking light, but it's pretty goddamn unlikely. And your brain would never leap to that conclusion, you know? Anywho, moving onwards with the betrayal, the wordbearers are of course making their own preparations as well, including a most delicious betrayal of the one Ultramarine, apparently, who actually has a friend amongst the wordbearers. They actually also mention that Guilliman is kind of resentful of having been used as a example at Monarchia, which is interesting. And that entire point, too. The Ultramarines descending on Monarchia behaving like fucking world eaters for some goddamn reason. I get why he's annoyed. I mean, was he ordered to do this? That wasn't... Is that why he's resentful? Was he ordered to go in as hard and retarded as possible? That doesn't make any sense either, though. God, the problem with most of this, a lot of these plot points, is simply that it assumes the loyalists were fucking retards. Anywho, the fact that Guilliman is resentful of it is interesting. I can definitely see why, and why he would also be now very interested in trying to reforge, not a bond. He never really expects to get buddy friend with Lorgar, but at least close the rift somewhat. That's what he hopes to achieve with this cooperation. And as one word-bearer sergeant says, I am confident that this will put Monarchia behind us. Which, I mean, if it went the way the word-bearers were planning, it would have. It would have. And they certainly had made plenty of preparations. We get an intercept here, an interlude, more correctly, of a character called Faust, who is a part of the I know I'm gonna say world eaters a lot when I mean to say word bearers and vice versa, so just roll with it, okay? Faust is one of the world word eaters, there you go, Arch, army auxiliary units, and he talks about how he ventured out to the galaxy in the search of transgressive knowledge because he knew that there was so much more out there. And he makes a rather interesting mention that he headed out rimworlds towards where the word bearers were actively recruiting volunteer armies. That is rather interesting, because up until this point I've always been under the impression that the Imperial Army is a formation raised by Terra rather than the legions, and then assigned to legion formations. But this mention of volunteer armies, that's very interesting. Now, this has happened before as well. You can see in Ultramar, for example. There is mentions of Ultramar regiments, even with Ultramar-specified equipment, like the Illuminator pattern lasgun, which is an improved version of the lasgun created in Ultramar. Like, that's really cool and interesting, but these are clearly organized military formations, raised and organized in the form of the Imperial Army, as standing regiments. This mention of volunteer armies. Now, it could be the same thing, but the word bearers never really ruled an empire like the Ultramarines, so to me, it sounds as if the word bearers were essentially actively recruiting fanatical militia forces under the guise of bringing them into the Imperial Army. That's really fascinating. And the description of them as well, from the point of view of the Ultramarines and their army regiments, they describe the word-bearer army elements as heathen auxiliaries. It's a really interesting term. It brings to mind a certain image, doesn't it, of ill-disciplined, unorganized, ununiformed savages carrying literal, and they talk about this later as well, literal spears and swords and stuff. That is really cool. That's a really nice touch because, yeah, the word bearers would absolutely do that, both to increase their military might, which they're absolutely obsessed with, bearing in mind. The word bearers are one of the largest of the Astartes legions, and they were increasing in size so rapidly specifically because of their need to grow, their need to expand, their need to become a massive military force to exact their vengeance upon those who they believed had wronged them. And heathen auxiliaries? Oh, absolutely. Easily impressionable, mortal auxiliary troops that can also be used as expendable fodder for rituals? Oh yeah, that makes so much sense. Something else that makes sense is the Ultramarines bitching to the head of logistical services on the planet of Calth that they are 6 minutes behind schedule. One of the things that I love the most about this book isn't just the fact that the loyalists are competent here, which is nice in and of itself, but it's also that there's honestly so many characters here I really like that are just for this book, which are really kind of sad. Like, first of all, it shows Gilliman in a far more human light, which is nice. You have the server, Hest. You have Telemachus. He's a dreadnought, but he's a new dreadnought. He's just recently been interned within the dreadnought sarcophagus, and even before that, he's only been in service for 10 odd years. And considering that the legionary recruits might be, raised up to full legionnaires at the age of 16, 17, recruited much earlier than that and then undergo maybe half a decade or so of training, he's basically, in his mid-20s, and he's a dreadnought now. That's really cool. And he's also talking about how he struggles to deal with this fact, how he struggles with the simple idea that he is not a venerable ancient dreadnought. He's a new dreadnought, He's fresh. He's just a decade of service. And how he struggles with his emotions too, his anxiety, his anger, his need to sleep, and yet also his fear to sleep. Goddamn. This is really one of the best books in the goddamn entire Horus Heresy series, and a lot of it is just minor stuff like this, you know? It's really, really cool. We also get to hear more from Guilliman now as well. So previously, we've basically heard that he regretted his part in the humbling of the word-bearers at Monarchia. He viewed that as unnecessary, but perhaps not for quite the reasons we originally thought. There's an interesting passage later on where the scrap code problem is starting to become an irregularity, a problem too big to be natural. Guilliman is informed of this, and he decides to bring up the question as circumspect and cautiously as possible to Lorgar, thinking that this could be something that the word-bearers brought in with them. They refer to the scrap code almost as if it's some kind of... He literally uses the metaphor like barnacles on a ship. I'm like, really? Does coding work like that? I guess in the 41st millennium it might. I mean... the potential of a data virus from outside, I mean, sure, possibly, but Anywho, Guilliman wants to bring this up in private over a long-range transmission to try and prevent any hurt feelings of this. He wants to bring it up in private, very personal, make sure that there's nothing public about this. All right, that makes sense. He brings this up to Lorgar and several of his captains in a transmission, and immediately the word-bearers are very suspicious. They're wondering, has he figured anything out? And so they're very hesitant. And Lorgar does here something that's actually kind of brilliant. That's one of the few smart things Lorgar has ever done. He cuts the transmission to his rest of his commanders, and he acts outraged. He's just like, oh my god, how dare you? How dare you? Which is exactly the right thing to do, because he knows Guilliman has been literally ordered to play nice, and he can just play off these accusations as just outrage, and Guilliman, of course, no, don't... I'm not saying you've done anything here, which, of course, then spills the beans, Now Lorgar knows it's nothing... Guilliman doesn't have a firm suspicion of what it is he is doing, which is what he's looking for. They also mention how lifelike his transmission is, which will turn into a little bit of a plot point later on. So, fuck it. Let's spoil that one now, because it's kind of important here. So, later on, a demonic entity literally just manifests on the bridge of Guilliman's ship, which... that's playing fast and loose with the rules of the war, but hey, details. And it might be that the Lorgar in front of Guilliman right now is actually Lorgar, or at the very least some form of warp transmission of Lorgar. How the hell Guilliman's technicians hooked him up to that and so on. It's one of those plot points that sound really cool, but the more you think about it, the less it makes sense, really. Oh well. Details. But then afterwards, Guilliman wanders off to have a little bit of a think about this, and a little bit of a sulk too, if we are to be honest, when he comes across Thiel, the ultramarine marked for censor, who has been amusing himself with Guilliman's private weapon collection, because he figures he's about he's in about as much shit as he possibly can get, so a bit more shit isn't gonna hurt. So he amuses himself for a while. Guilliman then arrives in his private weapon collection, undoubtedly immediately notices what's been going on, and he forgot about Thiel, which is interesting, because Primarchs can't forget things. It's basically an impossibility, but again, details. It makes him feel more human, which is nice, because Guilliman kind of needs to be a little humanized, honestly. And he starts talking a little bit about Lorgar. He vents a little bit, basically, to Thiel. And it's like he, it's like he views Thiel as a disappointing son. It's almost as if he figures he's gonna drum him out of the Legion or have him shot or something, because he really bears his soul to him a little bit, which I don't think he would do if he thought Thiel would be, remaining in good standing. And he talks about Lorgar. He talks about how changeable he is, how quick to please, and yet how angry he gets as well, like a child. If he were not my brother, he would be a political embarrassment. Which is really interesting. There's a little bit of it. Is this Gilliman's real thoughts here, or is this simply a little bit of Gilliman's frustration coming out? He even goes so far as to say that he knows what he would have done with him, suggesting that Gilliman, if he was in charge, might simply have... I don't know if it suggests he'd have him just killed, but at the very least he'd have him exiled, quote-unquote, to some distant corner of the galaxy. Keep him and his wild fanatics somewhere far out of sight and view. Possibly. It's quite interesting, because it seems to contradict his previous attempt at making nice. Gilliman is a bit mercurial in this one, which I do actually kind of like, because it makes him feel a bit more human, honestly. He's a little bit more changing, a little bit less rigid and set in stone. He has some actual emotions, you know? Which is nice. It's very nice, in fact. The idea, too, that he really does not get along with Lorgar, you know? He's really trying, but he really doesn't like him very much. And he's doing this primarily because of Horus, and because he sees the strategic necessity of ensuring that the Ultramarines and the Wordbearers can get along, at the very least to the level of executing a combined military campaign. That's cool. Again, it doesn't bode well for Thiel that he's venting all of these deep, dark inner frustrations to him, but oh well. Thiel's a good boy. He'll get out of this alive. Thanks to the Wordbearers, I suppose. And speaking of those, they are simultaneously engaged in some of their own magic rituals. They have brought stones from Istvan, which, again, brings up yet further questions of if they had the time to get here, why didn't any other word have? Sigh. Anywho, he's brought stones from Istvan and also gene seed, which he's going to be sacrificing in a massive ritual, and he's basically going to be, sacrificing the sun itself, which is, what word would be fitting of a ritual designed to sacrifice a solar system's sun? Ambitious? I mean, it fits, and yet I feel like it somewhat lacks, well, ambition, ironically enough. But yeah, that's pretty much what they're planning to do. He also then orders Erebus, that arrives down on the planet to begin the ritual. He's the one who gives the word for the betrayal to actually start. And this is one of the most interesting conversations in the whole book. And I'm saying something because I like a lot about this book. But there is a conversation between Chure, a wordbearer. I wonder how many times I've already mispronounced the Legion name at this point. And Honorius, an Ultramarine. The two are something very rare in their legions, friends. They're the acquaintances, at the very least. They came to know one another and teach one another things, points of their own views and perspectives, and they respect one another. They genuinely are fond of one another. And so they were chosen as the ambassadors to meet and have a little dinner before the arrival of the Primarchs to kind of solidify the partnership a little bit. Of course, for the Wordbearers, there was also a alternative idea as well. And Chure, how do I put this? First and foremost, he starts talking about the sense of clarity that the Ultramarines have, and how lucky they are to have it. He speaks of how he and many of the Wordbearers feel burdened by Lorgar, which did come across to a degree in the first Heretic, absolutely. How they are conditioned to obey him, regardless of how much they might disagree with his methods or his goals. And he gives us the beautiful line, "We no longer bear the word, we bear Lorgar." And he even goes so far as to say that many within the Legion have grown to despise Lorgar, and are of the opinion that they suffer under a brilliant, yet also thoroughly fallible commander, and how they have been unable to find their own purpose within the galaxy, in large part due to Lorgar's mercurial nature, his weakness, the fact that he gets led around the nose by his advisors and never really hits his stride. Honorius, on the other hand, actually defends Lorgar because he's aghast by this. You despise your Primarch, and that's crazy. Yes, you may not have found your purpose yet, but be assured, you will find it eventually. And of course, Shure is like, you're defending him? Because he, of course, knows what's coming. And he then... It's almost like he's begging the Ultramarine to figure out what's going on. He starts talking about the power of betrayal and how it was so thoroughly demonstrated during the Battle of Istvan. He just says it straight up, and Honorius is of course confused. Like, there's been a battle in the Istvan system? Was it a compliance and so on? And he just kind of, no, hold on. Really think about what I'm saying here. It's genuinely like he's begging him to figure out what's going on. He spells it out for him, Wouldn't this have power? Wouldn't me betraying you right here, not our Primarchs, me betraying you, a friend to a friend, betraying one another, would that not have real strategic power? He's literally just kind of like, please figure it out. And he's been sent there because he has something to prove to his legion. He has something to prove to the rest of the Wordbearers that he is also loyal, that he can hate the Ultramarines as much as anyone else. And Honorius, finally, the dominoes clash. He's starting like, oh, hold on. The 1 + 1 equals, oh fuck. And he realizes that just in time to look up, staring into Chure's bolt pistol, and have his brains blown out. It is an excellent piece of writing, because again, it makes both parts look good. It makes the Wordbearers look sneaky, and yet also a little bit desperate, It gives them so much weight and emotion to that scene. And you've also got the Ultramarine. He's not just like, under what, pistol? No, he actually does figure it out. He just figures it out a second too late because of how ridiculous it is, Oh, if only more of the Horus Heresy was written like this. It would make a good series, an amazing series. But of course, one small betrayal after dinner isn't the extent of the world... I almost said eaters, Wordbearers' plans. They have also captured a freighter, a bulk freighter, and these can be pretty goddamn large. These can be battle-sized, massive, although in this case it sounded like a more small to mid-sized vessel. And the Wordbearers apparently have possessed this thing, it sounds like, with a demonic spirit composed of the tortured souls of its previous crew members. That is some hardcore shit right there. It coasts slowly and controlledly into the Calth system, giving off all the correct identification codes, and nothing appears array, all the way up until the very last second when it is too late for anyone to do anything about it, when it lights its engines to maximum thrust and rips straight through the Calth high anchorages, both destroying a load of vessels whilst doing so, and also, and this is by far the most key, because despite destroying literal battleships and stuff, it strikes the primary hub of command and control, where the data engines are now dealing with all of the clutter over Calth after the server went off to try and deal with the scrap code, so there is no longer any human taking control of the weapons grid. Instead, it is all up to the machines, which are now destroyed. So, here's the thing. This is one of the biggest plot hole thingy-bobs in this book. First and foremost, a vessel can't simply just light its engines like that and propel itself forward at that kind of speed. That doesn't happen. It would take hours, probably, for this vessel to reach the kind of speed required to hammer through multiple dockyards, multiple vessels, and into the main server area, all of which are heavily armored, mind you. A space vessel doesn't go from 0 to 1 billion kilometers in the flash of an eye. There's not a whole lot of, obviously, friction or resistance like that in space, but you still have to build up some speed, and the way it's described makes it sound as if the ship was coasting in as usual on basically maneuvering thrusters, and then hit its engines all at once. Now, maybe it could be some kind of demonic propulsion, possibly, since again, it sounds as if the vessel is basically possessed. Maybe it's essentially a demon engine at this point, and maybe it draws some kind of energy from the rituals that have already begun on Calth. Possibly, but again, this is a neat idea of the surprise suicide vessel that I don't actually think would work out particularly well. And secondly, too, all of the cogitators, all of the command and control machines are in the same area? Why? The server told us about this earlier. Hest, I believe his name was. He said that, the command and control grid is scattered across Calth. If he was to be evaporated, somebody else on the other side of the planet would take over immediately like that. And presumably there would be tons of other fallback measures as well. But all of the computers, all of the cogitators that are supposed to be taking over this kind of stuff, one a day as busy as this, they're all in one place? Why? I mean, that's dumb. And they're in orbit? Really? You placed the command and control center for your orbital defense grid in orbit. Again, why is the question that keeps resounding through my head. Surely this piece of shit should have been buried beneath a fucking mountain to make sure that it couldn't get nuked out of existence. But no, in orbit it is. Where apparently, and this is another part of it too, they describe it as if this freighter travels at a bajillion zillion kilometers an hour, and before anyone can do anything, it's through all of the defenses and smashing through the shipyards. If that was actually how acceleration and speed worked in 40k, it's essentially the same kind of plot hole as we saw in that movie with a certain franchise which is now dead, which we shall not mention, where suddenly Captain Purplehair weaponizes warp speed. It's like, oh shit, why isn't everybody doing this? Why isn't everybody literally just taking a freighter and using it as fire ship to just slam through your enemy's formations? Of course, again, this was extreme close range, movement, activation of engines, but the Raven Guard could do this. Reflex drive, just have the engine, because they're then coasting on, you're just coasting in, so there's some power to engines, and reflex drive allows for some power to engines. Surely the Raven Guard could just make invisible giant torpedoes capable of annihilating practically any fleet at this point then. Yeah, the freighter is a cute idea, but it doesn't actually really work, in my opinion. The next step of the betrayal, though, absolutely does. One in orbit and one down on the planet below. The first action of the Word-Bearer's fleet is to begin prowling along the dockyard lines, where all of the ultramarine vessels are sitting in their slip docks cold. All of their machinery is at absolute minimum power. For maintenance, for checks, for loading, for replacement parts, all of the myriad of things a warship needs to do before embarking upon a lengthy, massive campaign. According to one example, it is stated that it will take upwards of 50 minutes for one of these vessels to become combat ready. The Word-Bearers, of course, already are combat ready. And it is a mortal captain that realizes what is happening before even Primarch Guilliman. He is sitting in his own vessel, is desperately trying to rouse any kind of power to defend himself, when he realizes that the word-bearers, they're firing, they're moving, their shields are up. They knew this was going to happen. They were prepared for this. It's kind of amusing that Gilliman doesn't notice this obvious fact until several minutes later. But then again, Gilliman also isn't Astartes. To him, the idea of Space Marines fighting Space Marines is an almost impossibility. Though, again, after Monarchia, I don't know, part of me wants to suggest that maybe Gilliman should have been more prepared, more wary and suspicious, but at the same time, he didn't really have any reason to, and he undoubtedly did, as he has said, view this as an order from Horus, as a reconciliation. Gilliman basically already thinks he has seen through Horus's plan here. Poor Gilliman. See, this is the problem with thinking you're the cleverest bastard in the room. Now, again, I'm being too harsh on poor little rowboat girly man here. Like, again, he had absolutely no way to know what was going to happen. He really didn't. And when he thinks he knows the backside of the deal, the fact that this is organized by Horus, essentially because Horus wants to see how high the Ultramarines jump when he says jump, you know, Gilliman thinks he's seen through all of this, and if only he knew, I suppose. And down on the surface, of course, both the word-bearer formations and their heathen auxiliary also know exactly what is happening. The massive destruction in orbit is creating huge lightning flashes easily visible from the planet down below. And undoubtedly they would also have other signals as well, both material and immaterial, to tell them that, yep, party's on, boys. And so they're already organizing, already preparing, and heading towards their allies, with murder in mind, whilst the Ultramarine auxiliary units, the Imperial Army units, and of course the Ultrasmurfs themselves have absolutely no idea what is happening. And this is also the shock that Chure was talking about, that he was telling Honorius about, the power of betrayal, the mind-numbing effect of the impossible being carried out right in front of you. And we see this with several Space Marines. The Ultramarines react quickly, but reacting quickly in a war between post-human super soldiers is all too goddamn slow. And the opening salvos of the betrayal on Cal sees entire companies of Ultramarines wiped out in moments or irreversibly shattered, leaving the rest of the battered, bruised, and shell-shocked survivors to scatter off into the nearby countryside. Although, the word-bearers are making one mistake here, but we'll get back to that a bit later. Because for now, it's all the Ultramarines making the mistakes and getting gunned down for it, although they do react with a fair degree of speed again. In this kind of a fight, a moment's hesitation is far, far too long. And Gilliman, also, I like a lot of the descriptions here, because it shows how ridiculous it all is. A fucking Grand Cruiser falls out of the sky and impacts in the middle of the city. And what I love about that is, this is a disaster, okay? This is tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people dead, billions upon billions of dollars, you know, dollars quote unquote, property damage. It is an absolute astounding disaster, the likes of which we probably have never seen in human history. It's like Hiroshima times 5. And this is a sideshow. I love that. Like, again, the writing in this book is mostly just so spot on. I love the sense of scale this gives. Just a massive space-borne warship impacts a city, and this is, it's unfortunate, but compared to the rest, it's nothing. I do love that. Meanwhile, Gilliman is starting to wonder what the hell is happening, and he wants to get in contact with Lorgar, of course, because his rationale now is that... I like this one. His rationale is... the word-bearers think we're attacking them, or think that we're implicit in something, we're trying to kill them. All of their worst fears have been realized, and so now they are attacking us preemptively. Alright, that is an interesting theory, and I can see like how that might come about, but once again, as the captain of the ship that got murdered pointed out, the word-bearers are already moving, whilst the Ultramarines are all sitting cold. Perhaps you could attribute this to some kind of paranoia on behalf of the word-bearers, but Gilliman also notices that it is only the Ultramarines that are talking on the, established Vox links. Only the Ultramarines are asking what the fuck is happening. The word-bearers are completely silent. Again, I feel like Gilliman should probably have reacted a little bit swifter here, but nobody's perfect. And again, I like the fact that it's actually giving some humanity to Rowboat Girly Man, and when he does act, he does so with considerable fury. But that's gonna have to wait until the next episode. So, until then, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon as we continue No Fear. Have a good day.